Hi, welcome to the Linnean Society's lunchtime lecture. That is a bit loud, actually. So, my name is Leanne Melbourne, and I am the Events and Communications Manager here at the Linnean Society. So today we have Mark Peter Simmonds OBE talking about reforming the whale. Mark Simmonds is a biologist who has served as a member of the scientific committee of the International Whaling Commission for over 20 years. He is the senior marine scientist of Humane Society International and a visiting research fellow at the University of Bristol. He is the author/co-author of over 200 scientific papers, reports, articles and reviews, and a number of books including Whales and Dolphins, Cognition, Culture, Conservation and Human Impacts. Mark has helped to raise the alarm about the impacts of chemical pollution and marine debris on seals and cetaceans, the growing significance of marine noise, and the threat posed by climate change to marine life. In the 2013 birthday honours of Her Royal Highness Queen Elizabeth II, he was appointed an OBE in recognition of his work in marine mammal conservation and environmental scientists. So today, Mark will be reflecting on the biology of whales, human-whale interactions, and our future relationship with these ocean giants. So let's welcome up Mark.
Thank you very much, Leanne. So, ladies and gentlemen, in a short presentation, such as this one, there may be a significance in the things that I don't say, as well as in the things that I do say. So, in brief, what I'm not going to do today is talk in any detail about whale anatomy, evolution, or genetics, nor will I present bloody pictures with an associated sermon about whaling. It's lunchtime. The correct time for that kind of blood and guts presentation would, of course, be dinner time. So instead, I'm going to use this most welcome opportunity to address this most learned society and to peer back through history at our interactions with whales, and then use that as a sort of lens through which to view where we are now. So I will hastily carve our history with whales into three unequal epochs. Firstly, ancient whaling, then the era of the great sailboat whaling, which you can see in this picture here, and finally, the modern period of mechanized whale harvesting, which will bring us up to date. So, our interactions with the whales surely started when Homo sapiens first came to live by the seashore. Fresh stranded whales brought the opportunity of food and other materials, bone, ivory, and baleen, for tools or for building, and there's plenty of evidence for this. So scavenging off carcasses has been going on for millennia and still occurs in some places today. The desire for more whale meat caused organized efforts to capture the whales to spring up in various places at various times around the world. The earliest images being scratched into stones found in South Korea and dated from around 6,000 years BC. There was organized whaling in the Bering Sea a few thousand years later, and then, famously, the Basque fishing industry emerges in the Bay of Biscay around 1,000 years after Christ. And at this point, when our activities become really significant for the whales, because even at this very early period of whaling, we may have started a process that caused declines in both the right and grey whales in the Atlantic Ocean. Leaping on to the next phase then in history, we come to the better known and much celebrated and romanticized phase of whaling, when sailboats plied the oceans, hunting whales, and we can again identify a few key dates here. So in 1596, for example, we find the discovery of Spitsbergen Peninsula, and its plentiful co-located bowhead whales draws hundreds of boats to these cold seas. Later, a little group of Quakers fleeing religious persecution hove up on a tiny speck of land called Nantucket off Cape Cod. They learn whale flensing techniques from the indigenous residents and then go on incredibly to form an industry which dominates the whaling scene from this tiny island for the better part of the next 2 centuries. During which time, of course, the early settlers move from the tiny little huts that you can see in the picture there on to fantastic mansions which are still in place on Nantucket, which kind of gives you some illustration of the value of the oil that they were harvesting from whales. Also coincidentally, of course, this period spawns the legend of Moby Dick, which is based on the real account of the whale ship Essex, which was also allegedly struck by a whale and sunk. I think the correct expression was stove to by a whale. Towards the end of the century, ingenious minds have turned towards how to make the industry more efficient, including the capture of the biggest rorqual whales, which had previously proved elusive. So here now we come to the period of explosive harpoons and diesel-driven whale ships. Soon, these increasingly mechanized harvesting machines are heading towards the southernmost end of the planet, because only here, by this time, are the whale populations still plentiful enough to allow us to reap the economic rewards that we're seeking. And further to the establishment of the Southern Ocean territories by Great Britain, which also empowered it to issue whaling licenses to other nations through this period, the whaling nations, which included South Africa, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Germany, start to argue about which nations have access to which sea areas and, of course, which populations of whales. And then finally, alarm bells start to ring in high places, not very far from here in London. So enter here Sir William Henry Flower, KGB, FRCS, and FRS, director of the natural history units of the British Museum, and he raises the first clear concerns about the sustainability of whaling. Among other things, he stresses that there is no closed season for the right whales in the Southern Ocean, and that the calf-cow pairs were being taken. He stated, and I quote, I would quite like to do an impression of him, but I don't know what he sounded like. I would imagine he sounded very grand. He looks rather grand, doesn't he? The result has been, to the southern right whale, what it has been to its Atlantic ally after its persecution by the Basques, although it was brought about in a much shorter time. To destroy it in its largest remaining breeding place was to destroy it everywhere. And he goes on to describe how recent expeditions to the Southern Ocean at this time had totally failed to find any right whales. By 1911, these concerns about the sustainability of the whale fisheries were so marked that the establishment decided an investigation of the remote industry was in order. And the place to send this expedition was to the main British whaling base on South Georgia. Here's a picture of it. So the museum, with the support of the Colonial Office, sent this gentleman, Gerald Edwin Hamilton Barrett Hamilton, and Major Barrett Hamilton has sadly rather disappeared from the annals of great biologists here, but I think he deserves a mention and he deserves some recognition. He was a widely published and doughty naturalist and a trusted pair of hands for this particular task, which was obviously going to be very difficult. However, sadly, and perhaps as an indication of the kind of life that people were experiencing out of South Georgia, he doesn't survive the expedition. But what does survive is his written account, which is then the first attempt to describe and raise concerns about the wastefulness of the whaling industry. More similar accounts would follow. So let's move on to the third period of whaling history, the modern period, as I'm calling it. So what's going on in this time is we now have, for example, by 1924, huge vessels are in play with a slipway at the stern up which even the most mighty bodies to have ever graced our planet could be hauled for their dismemberment. But the whales continue to decline, and the whaling nations, despite various efforts at managing the industry, continue to dispute until 1946. In 1946, the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling is concluded, and this treaty establishes the International Whaling Commission, which was and is still based in Cambridge here. However, the IWC also struggles to find a sustainable formula, and in 1982, effective in 1986, it slams on the brakes, zeroes its quota tables, and ends commercial whaling. pretty much. Then, over the decades that follow, the Commission gradually evolves into a body with a much broader focus, examining threats other than whaling to whales, and in fact, all cetaceans, including pollution, climate change, and ensnarement in nets. The bottom picture shows you what a meeting of the International Whaling Commission looks like. So that's the history outline. I don't think anybody's ever done it faster than that. And before I go on to my central theme of what we understand about the whales, I have to add one more major development to this history account, which is the declaration from Japan on Boxing Day last that they will now leave the International Whaling Commission but conduct commercial whaling in the North Pacific. A potentially disastrous precedent for the whales and also for the rule of international law. That's not a sermon, just a comment. When the ancient whalers looked at the world, they were not, of course, applying science, but they were driven by a need to survive and also to interpret the meaning of things that were happening around them. For example, the stranding of whales would have been a very major event, and they would undoubtedly have looked for the hand of God or gods in this. And I think it's pretty clear, for example, in this remarkable 1577 picture of stranded sperm whales on the North Sea coast, always itself a rare event, that the Dutch locals are terrified by the stranded monsters. Let's just focus in on them a little bit. And they're running away in terror. And you'll also see, if you look carefully, some rather odd features on the whales. For example, the one out in the breakers is spouting fountains of water. You can see sort of finny pectoral fins, and the tails are at an unusual fishy angle. These are mistakes in the depiction of whales that persist even through to today, and for example, Disney's Finding Nemo, also the whale in that spouts water out of its blowhole. So at this time, of course, the seas would have been vast, mysterious, and perilous, full of monsters. And indeed, the well-decayed and largely skeletal remains of a dead whale, the huge skull attached to a long, sinuous backbone, is very sea serpent-like. And there are even concerns about sea serpent stranding based on that sort of body washing ashore today. Come the next phase of whaling, the sailboat era, the systematic examination of nature, science as we understand it, has taken root. However, the whales have always presented a very particular problem in terms of our comprehension of them. Specifically, they are very difficult to view. It's very difficult to see the entire body of a whale as it would be in nature. The whalers knew them from the shapes of their backs and their blowholes and from the blow. So this blow is not a fountain of water, it's a puff of a gigantic breath. A stranded whale loses its natural shape. It becomes deformed by the substrate that it's lying on, and also it becomes quickly bloated by the decomposition gases that build up inside it. Hence, early book illustrations of whales leave much to be desired. They are oddly contorted creatures, and you can compare here the bottom of the image on the far side, the better knowledge, if you like, that the illustrator had of other animals like the camelopardatus or giraffe, compared to those strange blobby whales at the bottom of the illustration. And you can again see a good example of a sort of blimp of a whale here in one of the earliest books that were designed for children of 1851. The whale is all blown up, if you like. So, whilst the great Victorian biologists, such as Sir Henry William Flower, are busy dissecting whales and describing what they find and naming species, Sir Henry, for example, correctly separating northern and southern right whales into two species, most people would have had very little appreciation of the true nature of the animals, whose remarkable fatty bodies had been rendered to improve their lives into candles and other commodities. However, the whalers, of course, knew more. And in particular, one skipper, Charles W. Scammon, who lived between 1825 and 1911, accurately drew and described a number of species, which he then published in a book. And we can make a nice comparison of the earlier cartoonish illustrations, for example, provided here by the French illustrator Lacypedes, I probably don't pronounce that correctly, with Scammond's drawing some 70 years later. So here's the early sperm whale, extraordinary sperm whale, and here's Scammond, the whaling skipper's much more accurate rendition of that animal. And here's a bowhead whale, and the same. And that very first picture that I showed you, the opening slide, there was a big black blob in the middle of that, which was a whale, and that too would have been a bowhead whale. So you can get some idea of what we thought these animals looked like. Did it matter that we generally knew them so poorly? I think perhaps it did, especially when we get to the Victorian era and the first attempts to recognize and address animal suffering come into play. For example, the RSPCA was founded in 1824, and great Victorians such as Charles Dickens were promoters of better care for animals, but the whales were very far away, literally out of sight, and anyway, they were monstrous in nature and therefore deserving of being turned into whale oil and burnt in our lamps and in our candles. The notion of the monster whale, as promulgated in Moby Dick, also quite suits the whaling captains. These were the famous and well-paid football heroes of their day. And on returning to home, swaggering into port, they would come back with tall tales of heroism, I'll try that word again, heroism, out on the high seas, battling with the whales. A poor haul of oil, or worst, a lost vessel, like the whale ship Essex, could be better explained by the work of a monster whale rather than the ineptitude on the part of the skipper, crew, or the shipwrights. My friend, Professor Hal Whitehead, who has spent much time out at sea amongst whales and who is the greatest living expert on sperm whales, opines that it is most unlikely that one would have rammed a boat. The whale ship Essex, on which the story of Moby Dick is based, was a lucky boat, kept going long beyond its prime and was lightly riddled, it's a wooden boat of course, riddled with shipworm before it fell apart on the high seas, perhaps in a storm. But that's not a good story or helpful one to skippers and investors. There's another phase, which I'm not going to show you, but when books become truly popular and owned by every household, there's a whole period of adventure books out at sea which are very, very popular. And again, the monster whale, typically the monster whale fighting the giant squid, is again present there. And I want to show you just one more picture from this period, just because it's interesting and I tripped over it during my research. So here in Vanity Fair in 1869, the sperm whales are celebrating the advent of mineral oil, especially in this case in Pennsylvania, and well they might celebrate. But first, at the point when whaling becomes highly mechanized, the scale of the harvest really shoots up. And there's a famous statement that recognizes this. So this is a statement by Quentin Walsh, who was serving on a whaleboat, and he notes that one modern factory ship can take more whales in one season than the entire American whaling fleet of 1845, which numbers over 700 vessels. So let's just have a little look at some of the numbers that are involved in this. So 20th century catches of fin and sperm whales have these extraordinary numbers associated with them. 871, 068, 761,000, etc., respectively. And in fact, more than half the total of all the large whales taken across all the centuries are taken through this period. $2.9 million whales were removed. That's the largest removal of animal biomass that the planet has ever experienced. And we can have a look at the shape of this. So this is a reasonably new diagram where you can see northern hemisphere takes and southern hemisphere takes divided. These are the removals of different whale species. And there's a dip in the southern hemisphere where it's most marked, which is to do with World War II, which was terrible for us, but was actually quite good for the whales in some ways. And what you'll also see is this is a classical picture of removal of a living natural resource, where they remove the big ones, which is the ones that are the key ones that they're able to catch at this time with their new mechanized approach. They're exploding harpoons, they're diesel-driven vessels. They remove the big ones and then they move on to the slightly smaller ones. And this diagram is new because it's been corrected because it was became apparent in just the last few years or so that there was massive underreporting, cheating, if you like, by some of the whaling nations. And I have to wonder, were people thinking about the ecological consequences of this enormous removal of animals? And I think we shall probably never fully understand the consequences of this phase in our history on our ecosystems. Anyway, I think it was clear by 1982, when crowds of protesters gathered in Brighton outside the International Whaling Commission meeting there, which is the meeting where they concluded the end of commercial whaling, that thanks mainly to the advent of underwater photography and cinematography, whales were being viewed in a very different way. We could really see them now. We could see what they looked like in nature. Their voices had also been heard across the human world, thanks to the very popular recordings made by Roger Payne and others. Now we saw not monsters, but warm-blooded mammals that gently nurtured their young and which sang, rumbled, or clicked to each other across ocean basins. People were also increasingly taken to boats not to go and hunt them, but to go and look at them and photograph them. And this turns into a multi-million-dollar industry which grew up all around the world. And here's some pictures from Provincetown of what it looks like now. The growth was enormous in the 1990s. The industry was valued in 2009 at about $2.1 billion US per annum, still growing, and it involved about 13 million whale watchers and generated 13,000 jobs. And it's a lot bigger than that now. And here is a rather beautiful joint response to this expanding industry from the International Whaling Commission, working in this case with the International Convention for Migratory Species. It's a brand new whale watching guide, which I recommend to you and which you can find online. And it includes consideration of what makes good whale watching, and also an excellent species guide, which among other things shows you what a sperm whale looks like. So let's come to the present day. What do we now know about the whales that we did not know during our previous periods of harvesting them? So in recent decades, we've been able to deploy refined remote monitoring techniques, acoustics and genetics, and with tags and photo identification of individuals, we've been able to follow the lives of whales even out into the great depths. We've gone to places that we've never been able to go to before, and we've gone there with some of the whales down to depths of a kilometre or so. Of course, the great Victorian gentlemen biologists, some of whom seem to be looking at me at the moment, I don't mean you guys, I'm talking about the people around the wall. They knew, people like Sir William knew that they were looking at mammals. They would also have known about the whales' relatively low reproductive rates. However, the full diversity of whale kind is only now coming fully into focus. So throughout this talk, I have vaguely referred to whales, pointing mainly at the big ones, the focus of our organized historical exploitation of them. However, in what is now an infra-order, the infra-order cetaceans, we now recognize some 89 extinct species, including dolphins and river dolphins and beaked whales. And there are 15 baleen whale species, although the taxonomy of some is still being explored. Indeed, in my lifetime, a number of new species have been revealed, which I think is quite remarkable for such large animals. Some of those were beaked whales, which were literally hiding in the deep seas, and others were more cryptic, requiring geneticists to divide up their taxonomic units. And that's include animals that were quite common and regarded as pan-global, such as the minke whale and even the bottlenose dolphin. So these species are now 2 or more species. And that's important, because we tend to base our conservation around these taxonomic units. For some, such as the killer whale, shown here in this beautiful drawing by Lucy Mollison, the species concept is actually struggling to encompass what they are. Again, this is an animal found all over the world, but with regional forms and behavioral specializations, and they are sometimes, these groups of animals are sometimes referred to as ecotypes. Painstaking studies by Hal Whitehead and others have identified that some species have units that we can call cultural units, inheriting and sharing information through generations, i.e. how they understand and use their habitat, where they find their prey. What it means to be a sperm whale is taught to a younger sperm whale, probably by its mother, but possibly by others in its group. And when a group of behavioral scientists, and I'm very proud to say me, published a paper in Science just last month, we called for cultural and social biology to be used going forward in conservation. And very specifically, we called on the big international bodies that deal with this kind of matter to work on this, to rethink what it is that they're trying to conserve. Intelligence, of course, is well described for the sentient, self-aware, and highly social and innovative dolphins. The bigger whales have relatively large and complex brains as well, but they are much more difficult to interrogate. But one thing that I am convinced of is that they all have the ability to suffer. So, heading towards a conclusion, from a biological point of view, they are inherently unsuitable for attempts at sustainable harvesting, to say nothing of the high costs of actually having to monitor their populations out at sea, costs that are often forgotten. From an ethical standpoint, their marine habitat, their great size, their thick skulls and deep layers of tissue make them a nightmare to try and kill swiftly. Our new knowledge points to the need to behave towards them in a more precautionary and careful manner. The old paradigm of drawing lines on the sea and sharing the whales out as a resource despite its enduring popularity with the whaling nations needs to be locked firmly away in the vaults of history. So another look at the sperm whale. Meanwhile, we need science to focus on the modern threats, including marine pollution, especially the plastics now turning up, sadly packed inside the guts of some whales, and the PCBs blocking the reproduction of others, and also bycatch and climate change. The prolonged death over many months of whales towing fishing gear is a profound challenge to our notion that we are a humane species. Some whale populations will never recover from the rapacious removals of history. Some ocean areas remain empty because they've not been recolonized. The whales simply don't know where they are or how to use them. They've lost that cultural knowledge. Other populations are doing better, but to interpret this recovery as an open invitation to begin whole-scale harvest again is inappropriate and I think fails to learn the lessons of history. And finally, before I close, I want to show you a face of a modern whale conservationist. And some of you may recognize this face because you would have seen it across the newspapers just a couple of weeks ago as the first victim of the terrible Ethiopian Airways plane crash. This is Joanna Toole. And I want to dedicate this little presentation to her memory. So I need to thank a few people. And finally, another friend of mine has just recently returned from South Georgia, which we featured earlier in the presentation. And she took some photographs and some film down there, and she'd allowed me to use one of these photographs. And what you can see here now is South Georgia, plentiful whales, 3 different species in that photograph. You can see very distinctly the long back of the fin whale, the second largest whale ever to exist. On the left-hand side, sei whales in the foreground, and the knobbly lump on top of a humpback just above the fin whale. So as I look forward now to your questions, points, and observations, there's a lovely photograph of some whales to look at. Thank you.